The Biosphere as a Supercomputer, Self-Directed Evolution by Igor Kristovovich. Read by Adam King. Chapter 1, Darwinian and Alternative Theories. Chapter 1.1, Evolution of the Theory of Evolution. It is not known the name of the first philosopher who came to the idea that living organisms can change. It goes back to pre-Socratic time. The representative of the Milesian school of natural philosophy, Anaximander, the 6th century BC, believed that all animals originated from the water and then came to the land. That ancient view is in full accordance with the modern evolutionary concepts. In the writing of Caecilian Empedocles, 5th century BC, one can find the ideas of a similarity of the forms of the living and the survival principle of the fittest. In medieval European science, the opinion about the immutability of the living world was the prevalent one for centuries. It was a common belief, however, that all species were created by God and can only be changed depending on external conditions. The first scientist who ventured to offer a full theory of the evolution of the living world was the French Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He expounded on it in his fundamental work, The Philosophy of Zoology, published in 1809. Lamarck believed that an organism can pass on characteristics that it has acquired during its lifetime to its offspring, also known as heritability of acquired characteristics or soft inheritance. A giraffe, as an example, acquired a long neck, trying to access the hard-to-reach shoots on the tops of trees. After that, the British naturalist Charles Darwin came on stage. To his theory, which brought a break in biology, he came in a complicated way. Charles's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, anticipated some of Lamarck's evolutionary ideas. E. Darwin wrote, in particular, "All warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament, which the great first cause, endued with animality, with the power of acquiring new parts, attended with new propensities, directed by irritations, sensations, volitions, and associations, and thus possessing the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity, and of delivering down those improvements by generation to its posterity, world without end." Moreover, he anticipated the ideas of his grandson, writing, "Strongest and most active animals should propagate the species, which should thence become improved." In the poem, The Temple of Nature, published posthumously, E. Darwin mentioned even the main idea of his grandson in a passage that describes the struggle for existence. Sexual competition, hunger, the pursuit of security is, according to Erasmus Darwin, the main causes of evolutionary change. We can presume that Erasmus's grandson was impressed with the works of his great-grandfather and got his ideas imprinted in his mind. A significant event in the biography of the researcher was the round-the-world trip on the ship Beagle, which took him 5 whole years. Over these years, the young man made many useful observations, one of which returned his thinking to the writings of Erasmus Darwin. In solitary Galapagos Islands, Darwin explored and collected small birds from the family that was, as he believed, the finches. It turned out a century later that Darwin's finches were actually the tanagers. Charles's attention was attracted by the difference in the structure of the finches' beaks. Darwin concluded that the shape of this organ changes depending on the environmental conditions, so the adjusted beak boosts birds' chances for survival. In certain periods, seeds and cacti became available to them, so the individuals with massive conical beaks had the greatest chance of survival. In other periods, soft insects prevailed, and the beaks became straight and elongated. This conjuncture brought Darwin to the idea of the natural inherent in nature, evolution. After returning from the journey, the young scientist continued to work actively, and in March 1837 came to the idea not just about evolution within one species, but about transforming them, that is, about the transition of the living being from one species to another. With the exact definition of term species, Darwin was not certain for the rest of his life. That did not stop him from naming his fundamental work, The Origin of Species. What caused the species of passing from one kind to another was not completely clear. The evolution of the beaks of one breed of birds seemed logical and reasonable. But what is the reason for the appearance of new species? The works of the English priest and scholar, Thomas Malthus, had a pivotal impact on Darwin's thinking. Having read the 6th edition of his An Essay on the Principle of Population, Charles came to a startling discovery. It struck him that under certain circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved, and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. From now, everything was lined up in a logical chain. 1. The living world does not remain unchanged. 2. Changes occur gradually in small steps. 3. If the changes contribute to survival, the next generation inherits them and takes advantage of the struggle for existence. 4. When changes accumulate, the living organism changes into a different species. This idea was so radical that it frightened the author himself. Only in 1844, he shared a new theory with the famous botanist Joseph Hooker, attributing, "It is like confessing a murder." Hooker did not like Darwin's ideas. He could not imagine how such dramatic changes as the appearance of a new species could be put into action. It's worth mentioning that Hooker's doubt is still unanswered to this present day. Darwin continued working on his theory when suddenly, in 1856, he read a paper by Alfred Russel Wallace on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species, which contained clear similarities to Darwin's thoughts. Wallace came to this concept when he was in a fever and bedridden. Read the writings of Malthus. True, Wallace proposed that species change and are formed under the influence of the environment, while Darwin believed that these changes are due to competition of related species. As a result of this competition, the strongest survive and the weakest are doomed to disappear. In 1858, at the height of work on the book, Darwin read a new article by Wallace this time describing natural selection. Darwin's famous book, On the Origin of Species, was published in 1859 and received a very cold assessment of specialists. Professor Samuel Houghton from Dublin wrote, "All that was new in them was false, and what was true was old." But for the public, the revolutionary theory had an extraordinary success, with the entire stock of 1,250 copies oversubscribed when it went on sale on November 22nd. After all, the book provided the scientific justification for the fittest species dominance so dear to the heart of the Great Britons. The scientific basis for the prosperity of the strongest as a result of the robberies, wars, and conquests became just a natural way of living. After all, the book's title was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. At the same time, new theory quietly undermined most religious dogmas. God, as follows from it, has nothing to do with the life evolution and creation of the species, including the man. Maybe he created something at the very beginning, certain common ancestor, a worm or a bacteria, and left them to fight and survive on their own. Living forms changed, competing with others, progressed and finally grew into Homo sapiens, the crown of creation. Races do not just coexist, they do not compete even. They are fighting with each other for survival. This is the nature of the nature. One wins, the other disappears. Rule Britannia, rule the waves. One of the first to appreciate the opportunities given by the new theory was the representative of the dominant race and communism theoretician Karl Marx. By the time of his acquaintance with the origin of species at the age of 42, the great thinker had already formulated his own theory of the struggle, which he wrote in the Communist Manifesto. The violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. Now the communist ideas found their scientific foundation in the very nature of the man. Violence is a natural action taken in response to the bourgeoisie bad behavior. Filled with a joy, Marx, together with Wilhelm Liebknecht, attended 6 lectures on Darwinism, read by the Darwin's bulldog, the zoologist and agnostic Thomas Huxley, for the British workers. Marx even intended to assign one of the volumes of his Capital to Darwin. The latter politely but firmly refused this high honor. The followers of Marx highly appreciated the theory of the English researcher. Leon Trotsky wrote, "Darwin's discovery is the greatest triumph of dialectics in the field of all organic matter." Well, let us recall that Darwin did not discover evolution. The main ideas were expressed long before him. Darwin gave a materialistic explanation to the organic expediency. A few years after the publication of The Origin of Species, Herbert Spencer introduced a summative formula, survival of the fittest. He wrote quite definitively, "The universal law of nature, a being that is not energetic enough to fight for its existence, must perish. Was Darwin involved in the social interest and the conclusions drawn from his work? After all, he was even credited with influencing the Nazis' ideology. We must resolutely defend him. An honest scientist only openly formulated what he believed in and what life experience dictated. In all editions of his work, Darwin insistently called for the verification of the theory of evolution and constantly pointed out its shortcomings. In his book chapter, Difficulties on Theory, he openly admits that cannot explain the origin of complex organs, such as the eye. The theory could be struck dead with a new paleontological excavation. He has no idea where the animal instincts came from. These questions still remain inexplicable for the mainstream science. The answer to them is given in the book you are listening now. But whatever revolutionaries, conquerors, and Nazis used Darwin's theory, is it the author's fault? He conscientiously stated his hypothesis, that is all. Let us now try to evaluate whether the theory of evolution is, as it is declared, the scientific theory. Wikipedia states that the term theory refers to scientific theories, a well-confirmed type of explanation of nature, made in a way consistent with scientific method. It includes characterizations, observations, definitions, and measurements of the subject of inquiry, hypotheses, theoretical, hypothetical explanations of observations and measurements of the subject, predictions, reasoning including deductive reasoning from the hypothesis or theory, experiments, tests of all of the above. Darwin fulfilled the first 2 points of scientific method. He observed the tanagers and measured the size of their beaks. He studied the breeds of pigeons and recorded differences. The results were carefully analyzed in diaries, letters, articles, books. Finally, the hypothesis was formulated. Living organisms change gradually. The most successful changes continue to exist, and the rest perish. With the 2 remaining points of the scientific method, his theory turned out to be an ill luck. How can we experiment with the evolution that lasts for millions of years? Agree that checking its prediction is not a matter of tomorrow. Note that these shortcomings were allegedly corrected. The Canadian evolutionary scientists were able to predict the inevitability of the appearance of a transitional species from legless fish to quadrupeds, and found it, they called it Tiktaalik, exactly where they were looking for, in the sediments of the late Devonian 375 million years ago. Canadians arbitrary concluded that Tiktaalik is not a separate independent species, but it is a transitional species. Let us leave this logical exercise to their conscience. But where, for God's sake, was a successful experiment conducted by evolutionists? Is there a single, observable process that has led to the speciation? If not, can we call the evolutionary concept of Darwin's a theory? As we see, Darwin's philosophical statements are not drawn to the theory. The mechanism for the formation of new species was a complete mystery for Darwin. Living cells, as Darwin saw them, were mere small cavities filled with protoplasm. Their exorbitant complexity was not nearly known at that time. Darwin had no idea about the mechanism of inheritance. He included that in all tissues of organisms there are sub-microscopic granules, gemmules, which carry hereditary signs from the cells of the body to the sex cells, thus ensuring the possibility of directed, and not random, changes in the course of the evolution. The life of the theory of evolution cannot be called cloudless. In fact, it became dominant only in the mid of the last century. From the first day after the publication and until today, the theory fights for existence itself. As early as in 1867, there was an English engineer, Fleming Jenkin, who reviewed Darwin's theory in his article The Origin of Species. Jenkin criticized Darwin's evolutionary theory by suggesting that Darwin's interpretation of natural selection couldn't possibly work as described if the reigning hypothesis of inheritance, blending inheritance, was also valid. Jenkin wrote, "Suppose a white man to have been wrecked on an island inhabited by Negroes. Our shipwrecked hero would probably become king. He would kill a great many blacks in the struggle for existence. He would have a great many wives and children, while many of his subjects would live and die as bachelors. Our white's qualities would certainly tend very much to preserve him to good old age, and yet he would not suffice in any number of generations to turn his subjects' descendants white. In the first generation, there will be some dozens of intelligent young mulattoes, much superior in average intelligence to the Negroes. We might expect the throne for generations to be occupied by a more or less yellow king. But can anyone believe that the whole island will gradually acquire a white or even a yellow population? After acquainting himself with Jenkins' objections, Darwin believed that their correctness can hardly be questioned and called them Jenkins' nightmare. The discovery by Gregor Mendel of the transfer of hereditary information in a discrete way, with the help of indistinct genes, eliminated Jenkins' objection. Darwin failed to use it. Darwin knew about and even read Mendel's article, Experiments on Plant Hybridization, but did not appreciate this truly scientific work, preferring to suffer from uncertainty and nightmares. Mendel's work, which during his lifetime found the way to 120 libraries of the world, remained unappreciated and was forgotten for a long time. It was rediscovered 30 years after first publication. In 1890, the Dutch Hugo de Vries and the German Karl Marx detected the hereditary transfer by the genes, only to find out that they had been preceded by the Austrian monk 3 decades earlier. Whatever it was, the presence of a discrete mechanism of heredity saved the theory from Jenkins' nightmare, but instead deprived it of the main core, a gradual, smooth transition from one quality to a slightly better one. It turned out that changes from parents to descendants occur spasmodically. The origin of the man from the monkey has become very doubtful. After all, the last enjoys 48 chromosomes carrying hereditary information, and the human has only 46. Only in a nightmare, one can propose that 48 chromosomes turned into 47.9, and then to 47.8, and so on. No, the quantity of genes in any organism should be only whole and only even. One from the male parent and the other from the female one, whether you are an ape or a rose flower. Mendel's discovery was very unfortunate. Followers of Darwin already compiled beautiful drawings of the gradual evolution of man from primates and horses from eohippuses. Now everything was thrown into chaos. It turns out that there was no gradual transition, and it cannot be. But the scientific community did not give up. In 1912, amateur archaeologist Charles Dawson announced the discovery of a transitional link between the man and the monkey. Near the village called Piltdown, he found a skull that looked like a human, but with monkey features. The connection between man and primates was found. Darwinism received a big boost. Biological enthusiasts rushed to the place of discovery and dug out the jaw, fragments of the skull, and primitive tools. The discovery was dated to 500,000 years back. Darwin's hypothesis had finally become a scientific theory. The discovery became a subject of stormy discussions and meetings. "I at first took this thing for the petrified coconut," the lucky man said excitedly. "Enviable fantasy, isn't it? To find the tropical palm tree fruit in England. It is an extraordinary success by itself. The brain of this thing was almost the same as that of a man, and the jaw, well, typically a monkey." The scientists doubted, discussed, supported the missing link for a long time, and only in 1953 came to the final conclusion that Dawson presented a forgery. An orangutan jaw was attached to the human skull. The refutation of the forgery took 40 years. It must be pointed out that the missing link between primates and humans has not been found so far. From time to time, the newspaper headlines sensationally report a new find, but thorough studies consistently show that all these are separate species that originated independently. Much greater consequences were caused by the scam of the respected German scientist named Ernst Haeckel. He is the author of the terms Pithecanthropus, phylogeny, ontogenesis, and even ecology. In 1866, this outstanding, without any irony, scientist published a major work, Anthropogeny. You may not have read this book, but without any doubt you are aware of it, unless you missed biology class in high school. The fact is that the drawings of embryos from this book were moved to the pages of textbooks of many countries and continents. Haeckel illustrated the development of embryos of fish, frogs, turtles, birds, animals, and humans. Their similarity should make it clear that we all came from the same ancestor, as Darwin's theory teaches. It is evident. At first the embryos look the same, and then, assume as they evolve, they take on other forms. Why should a respected and recognized scholar stain his name with an absurd fiction? If the theory of evolution is a reliable and unshakable one, would it need a fake support? It took more than a century to expose this forgery. Only in 1997, the Haeckel's deception was demonstrated by the scientific community. But it was too late. Haeckel's drawings found the way not only to the British encyclopedian textbooks, but also penetrated the brains of school children and students. A study conducted in 2011 showed that many authors of school methodologies still include Haeckel's embryos in the textbooks of biology. Time passed since then. Science has been developing. It would seem that Darwin's theory should receive new confirmation with new scientific discoveries. Exactly the opposite took place. Even greater embarrassments replaced the nightmares of Jenkin and Mendel. In 1930, Vladimir Zworykin developed an electron microscope which yielded a magnification up to 2 million. Scientists have the opportunity to look inside the living cell. If the biological cell would be the same as Charles Darwin thought, and it was just a protoplasm encased in a shell, we would not have seen anything interesting in the microscope. It would be a shell, a liquid inside it, and some object floating in this liquid. Since one of the fathers of physics, Robert Hooke, first looked at the slice of the cork tree in the microscope and discovered a multitude of tiny cells, and up to the present, the amount of knowledge about this foundation of life has increased in an immeasurable degree. But much in structure of a cell, and especially its functioning, remains to this day not understood. The human body contains about 60 trillion cells. Can you appreciate such a number as a trillion? There is nothing easier. Let us say you became a millionaire and got at your disposal 1 million notes worth of $1. Put it in a column. Its height will be equal to 100 meters. From the top of this column, the owner of 1 million would be hardly seen, but it is only 1 million of thin paper bills. Let us take 1 billion. Your column will rise to a height of 100 kilometers. From here, you can greet an astronaut passing by. Go further and compose a column of 1 trillion pieces of dollar bills. This is not a big number, about 1/21st of the U.S. national debt. You have traveled about 1/4 of the distance to the moon. But remember, there are 60 trillion cells in our body. From the height of this pillar, the moon will remain far below. Such an incredible number of cells is located in our small body. Now let us go down to the earth and engage in reverse action. Shrink yourself 10 million times, trying to penetrate into the living cell and see how it is arranged from the inside. Having become quite small, we walk or swim near the cell, and what do we see? In front of us is a solid but flexible barrier, reminiscent of the fortress wall. This is a cell membrane, which not everyone can penetrate. It consists of a huge number of adjacent tadpoles, which are called lipids. In order to get inside the cell, like inside of the defended fortress, one should go through the gates, channels, formed by special proteins. Every gate has its own gatekeeper, who can open the gate or shut it. You join the crowd wanting to get inside and pretend yourself to be a sodium ion. They all try to get in the extracellular space, but strict gatekeeper knows exactly when and how many of you should be let in. Stop, guys, not all at once. You manage to slip past the watchman, leaving the rest of the ions waiting for another opportunity. Suddenly, you found yourself in a huge space filled with a lot of strange objects. It is a new world now, incomprehensible and full of unknown mechanisms. The various inhabitants of the cell are in constant motion. You feel some inexorable logic in their maneuvers, although you still are a long way from understanding it. The first thing you notice is a complex system of ropes and tubes supporting the cell membrane and shaping it. They stretch over the entire visible space, from one membrane's wall to the opposite. This system is called the cytoskeleton. Ropes and tubes support the cell in a stable but resilient state, just like your skeleton helps you to walk and take different poses, rather than spreading over the surface like a shapeless mass. You notice that the cytoskeleton does not remain constant. It changes shape and composition all the time. One thread disappears, and immediately an invisible hand builds another one made of some elementary bricks. All this happens in front of you, with incredible speed. Let us take one of the strands that form the cytoskeleton and examine it. It turns out not to be a solid one, but with the accordance of the mechanical laws, it has built the most reasonable structure, namely a pipe. Each layer of this microtubule is formed by 13 tiny bricks. You started to examine them, but unexpectedly you heard a scream. Watch out! Thousands of bricks start flying past you. You feel a reason behind their movement, although their logic is still incomprehensible. After a few seconds, you notice that all the bricks are lining up in a new pipe. and now a truck carrying a big load is running by this pipe at full pace. You hardly have time to jump out from under this truck because it rushes with great speed. It moves not on wheels, but on a pair of legs. The legs are stepping elusively fast. If you take a close look at them, you find that the length of each step is greater the leg's length, the protein whose step is 3 times longer than the total length of the legs. The legs are moving with a pace up to 100 steps per second. The fastest person in the world, Usain Bolt, manages to make 4.5 steps in a second, and his legs, incidentally, are not telescopic. Myosin 9, the quickest of the known to the date trucks, covers 60 microns per second. That is, a distance equal to 400 of its size. A 7-foot-tall man, moving at such a speed, would cover half a mile in a second, which is actually a supersonic speed. You are lucky to not get under this vehicle. Barely catching your breath, you notice that along with relatively large tubes, the shape of the cell is supported by thinner and even very thin lines. All this resembles the transport structure of a huge city. Highways, streets, lanes. Having familiarized yourself with this elaborated structure, you begin to notice other components of the cell, which are called organelles. Mitochondria, which is the cell's power stations, swim slowly, like floating diesel generators. Here is the Golgi apparatus, which modifies and sorts the proteins. Here is the endoplasmic reticulum, which forms an interconnected network of flattened membrane-enclosed arcs or tube-like structures. And here is the center of the cell, its library, which is called the nucleus. It is even harder to get inside of that than to penetrate through a membrane, but you are lucky again, got inside and observed strange twisted formations. If you look closely, you see strange twin spirals. Wow, yes, it's the famous DNA, whose structure was first proposed by Nobel laureates James Watson and Francis Crick in 1953. If you are in a human cell, you may count 23 twin spirals, each consisting of 2 chromosomes. Chromosomes resemble a comb with a shaft and teeth. Those teeth interconnect the spirals like the halves of a zipper. The teeth are all different. If you look closely, you may find 4 varieties of them. A biologist will explain to you that the 3 neighboring teeth encode one of the 64 letters of the biological code. These triple combinations are called codons. The codon letters correspond to certain amino acids. There are only 20 amino acids used in the DNAs. Suddenly, you notice that a strange protein formation, polymerase, has come to the nearest spiral. After a split of a second, the polymerase protein captures the DNA as the slider on the zipper and starts to unbutton it. From this particular place, which is known only to polymerase, the double helix begins to turn into 2 solitary ones. The area is immediately occupied by the amino acids, and one after another they begin to join the codons. Each codon accepts only the amino acid with proper coding. Therefore, the sequence of amino acids is strictly and unambiguously determined by the codon sequence over the length of the helix. This is the genetic code. Neighboring amino acids adhere to each other and form a long structure resembling a bead chain. When the amino acid chain reaches a predetermined length, the process is interrupted and the new structure compares itself into a protein that the body needs. The completed protein is sent to travel through the body, and the spirals turn into a double helix again. DNA has a microscopic size, but if all of them are extracted from the human body and extended in length, it may run from the Earth to the Sun and then back 50 times. For reference, the distance to the Sun is 93 million miles. Human DNA contains more than 3 billion teeth, that is 1 billion codons. If we print it in and make a book, we would have 1,000 volumes of 1,000 pages each. Placed in a column, these volumes would rise to a height of 100 meters, and this is not counting the covers. Is anybody on the earth who can boast reading that many books during a lifetime? Yes, there is. We read them millions of times each day. Our bodies are the most well-read bodies in the universe. We will return to the cell's composition and the sophisticated processes that take place in it. Everything we described so far is only a tip of the iceberg of the known complexity hidden in and behind the membrane. Charles Darwin did not suspect the immense complexity of a basic component all life is built with. Why did I mention the complexity of the cell structure in the chapter of the evolutionary theory history? Well, there is a reason. Long before Charles Darwin was born, another prominent man lived in England, William Paley. Paley was a priest and philosopher. He is best known for his natural theology exposition of the teleological argument for the existence of God in his work, Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity. This book made use of the watchmaker analogy. If crossing the wasteland, he wrote, I stumble over a stone, and I will be asked where this stone came from. I could, against all that I know, answer, he always lay there. And it would not be easy to reveal the absurdity of such an answer. But suppose now that I picked up the clock from the ground, and someone asks how they ended up in this place. Based on everything that I know, it would be difficult for me to imagine the same answer that I gave last time. This clock has always been there. In fact, if we find an object like a clock, or a portable radio, or a typewriter, then even without knowing how it got there, based solely on the accuracy and complexity of its structure, we will be forced to conclude that the object, watch, radio, typewriter, must necessarily have had a creator. There should have been some makers, those who gathered these objects for the sake of the task they are now performing, someone who comprehended these devices and figured out how to use them. It is difficult to argue with this because any evidence of thoughtfulness, any manifestation of intent that exists in the watch, can be seen in the creations of nature, with the only difference being that in the case of nature, they are incomparable, immeasurably more numerous and more significant. With the last statement, we are forced to agree, having become acquainted, albeit superficially, with the arrangement of the biological cell. An even more striking analogy was made in modern time by the British astronomer Fred Hoyle, who believed that the chance that higher life forms must have emerged in this, Darwinian, way is compared with the chances that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. If we calculate mathematically the number of random combinations necessary to build a cell by pure chance, it will be extremely large. The probability of such an event is immeasurably small. In practice, this means that such an event could not happen at all. Some researchers, feeling desperate, put forward a ridiculous proposition of infinite number of universes' existence. Accepting this presumption, they in essence eliminated the need for a science. Anything may happen in one of those innumerous universes. No physical law makes a sense with such a proposition. Mathematicians tried to compute the probability of creating not a cell as a whole, but only a single protein, assembled from the set of amino acids that are located in a certain strict order. As you remember, the order of amino acids during the assembly of the protein is given by the sequence of codons in the DNA. Should one of the amino acids be out of place, the protein will disintegrate and become worthless. The number of amino acid molecules in a protein may be different. For example, a simple yeast protein is constructed of 465 amino acids, the largest protein known to us, called titanium. It contains 27,000 amino acids located in a prescribed order. Let us take the smallest protein, only 300 amino acids in length, and find out the probability of its accidental occurrence. There are only 20 amino acids used by nature for the protein building. What is the probability that all 300 amino acids will line up in a certain order? First, amino acid number 1, then number 12, then number 16, then number 5, and so on to the final 300th one. One of the results obtained by scientists gives us a probability equal to 1 out of 10 to the 164th power. The denominator of this fraction, 10 to the 164th, determines the number of attempts that would be given to the one of the shortest protein build. How big is this number? Imagine a teacup filled with fine grains of sand. We will take out grains of sand one at a time and see when the lucky number on which it says protein 300 is found. This process will take a long time because the cup contains about 1 million sand grains, that is 10 to the 6th. For the success, we need to sort out 10 to the 164th grains of sand. There is no rush, however. Nature had a lot of time to create life, so we are not limited to just one cup. Okay, let us take 1,000,000 cups. With this amount, we can fill a swimming pool. 1,000,000 teacups will contain 10 to the 12th grains of sand. Now, take a lot of pools and pour them into the Great Lakes. To fill this volume, which is more than 5,000 cubic miles, we need 10 million swimming pools. Now the number of grains of varieties has reached 10 to the 19th. To find our happy grain of sand in this heap is quite problematic even for 1,000,000 years of nonstop labor. But this is not the end. How many Great Lakes are needed to fill the volume of our planet? The answer is about 50 million, since the total volume of the Earth is equal to 5 times 10 to the 26 grains of sand. Our sun would fit 1,000,000 Earths, and to fill the entire solar system, you need 10 to the 45th grains of sand. But even if we go over all the grains that fill our galaxy, called the Milky Way, from edge to edge, the probability of success will be only 1 out of 10 to the 119th. Each pick means accidental building 300 amino acids one on top of another like beads. Now it is clear to us the range of the objections Darwinist scholars had to face. If people would ever land on Mars, they may discover many interesting objects and give the origin of each of them various scientific justifications. Suppose that you are walking along the surface of the red planet and you see a stone, a sand dune, a canal, a meteorite. You as a real scientist can easily explain how they happened, what they consist of, and even quite accurately predict their further transformations. To do this, you need to conduct a chemical analysis of the soil, take the composition of the gases, analyze the perturbations of the atmosphere over the last 100 years, which was collected for you by a robot sent to Mars in advance. You calmly and methodically do your work, creating a picture and the history of the planet. But suddenly, you see before you, lying on the red clay, an object. Yes, sure, it is the same chronometer that William Paley showed his listeners. It looks like a thing made from quite elaborated, not accidental parts, assembled in a certain order. Moreover, it ticks, its arrows move, the wheels rotate, the ratchet guides the movement of the gears. It is possible that you will have the same desires when you saw a stone that was caught a couple of steps back. You will want to disassemble this subject, analyze it, dissolve it in acid, develop its computer model. But the first and indisputable thought that comes to your mind, someone has been here. It is unlikely that you will come to the conference podium and defend the idea of the accidental, natural origin of these watches. You will be laughed at by colleagues even before the discussion begins. Faced with such objections, the evolutionists did not despair. For them, there is nowhere to retreat. The alternative to natural evolution was frightening. This is a supernatural power. In other words, the God. With such a concept, a real scientist cannot live, for by doing so, he expels himself out of the scientific community. Great Darwin explained his break with a religious point of view in the following words: "A being so powerful and so full of knowledge as a God who could create the universe is to our finite minds omnipotent and omniscient, and it revolts our understanding to suppose that his benevolence is not unbounded. For what advantage can there be in the suffering of millions of the lower animals throughout almost endless time? This very old argument from the existence of suffering against the existence of an intelligent first cause seems to me a strange one." Well, Darwin's argument is weighty. If there is a God, then why did he create a world full of suffering? This argument has nothing to do with science, but is one of those that compels the Darwinists to hold on to the evolutionary concept. This is a pure ideology. It must be said that religious leaders were also concerned about this dilemma. After all, God exists, he is omnipotent and omniscient, but the world created by him is for some uncertain reason far, far from being perfect. Philosophical attempts to justify the creator were called theodicy. The term was introduced by Gottfried Leibniz. The accomplished philosophers began to put forward cunning theories explaining why suffering in this world was brought without the participation of the higher power. The irony is that both the religious philosophers and the evolutionists have tried to extricate the supreme being from under the accusation of malice. The main scientific objection to Darwin's supporters still was the conclusion of ill-fated genetics. Before Mendel, everything was lined up so beautifully. Minuscule gradual changes leading to a teeny tiny improvement of the breed, and voila! In a million years, a duck will turn out of a snail, and a sperm whale emerges from a hippopotamus. Genes have spoiled such a nice and linear picture, for they have forbidden teeny tiny changes. Therefore, scientists began to work on alternative theories of the development of the living world. First, they proposed saltationism, that is, the development of organism by leaps. Second, to show the evidence of speciation, they started to conduct the experiments with fruit flies. These insects begin to breed in just 48 hours of the birth. Therefore, changes could be observed in the laboratory and scientists can write their dissertations at a rapid pace. Got the difference? Previously, a biologist had to spend years and even decades on obtaining a scientifically meaningful result. Growing a new variety of the wheat, the researcher had to sow the field, make changes in the process of emergence and maturation, harvest the crop in autumn, analyze the results, and got only a single result, 1 point on the curve. The next result would be obtained in a year. Working with fruit flies is much more rewarding. 2 days. First generation is under a microscope, another 2 days, the second one, and so on. Doctoral theses were written in an accelerated pace. Well, saltationism concept did not explain anything. The fruit fly, even after thousands of generations, refused to turn into butterflies, dragonflies, or mice. They remained the same fruit flies, only godlessly maimed and unviable. Therefore, evolutionists did not stop on saltationism. Since the 1920s, they have made a leap themselves and moved on to the STE, or synthetic theory of evolution. That sophisticated scientific teaching, as announced, explained the genetic nature of the variability of organisms. At the beginning of the new theory were, as it is believed, Englishman Ronald Fisher and Russian biologist Sergei Chetverikov. British Julian Huxley proposed the term STE in 1942. 1937 was named the year of the STE emergence. This was a year when the book of the Russian-American genetics and entomologist taxonomy F. Dobzhansky, Genetics and the Origin of Species, was published. It contains the famous and categorical aphorism, "Nothing in biology makes sense, except in the light of evolution." However, one of the most prolific contemporary Russian authors, Dr. Alexander Markov, wrote in his latest book, The Birth of Complexity, Evolutionary Biology Today, Unexpected Discoveries and New Questions. Today, both classical Darwinism and the classical STE of the middle of the last century look more similar to museum exhibits than to living working theories. Troubles for STE began in the second half of the 20th century. The attention was drawn to the fact that STE does not explain the basic question, the formation of new species. Charles Darwin, if you remember, called his book The Origin of Species, although he never fully understood what the species meant. The Darwinists had nowhere to escape from this inquiry. Species must form from one to another, otherwise the whole harmonious picture of the origin of all living things from a common ancestor does not add up. We, unlike biologists, understand that the dog and the cat are different species, same as a dragonfly and an ant. A domestic silkworm and wild silkworm represent same species, but we are not specialists. We most likely are mistaken. No matter how much the genetics were mocking the poor fruit flies, no matter how mercifully they were poisoned, poured with radioactive rays, deprived of sleep, and fed with intricate mixtures, stubborn flies did not want to turn into beetles or hornets. They had legs growing out of their heads, another pair of wings appeared, but they remained the same fruit flies. What did the evolutionists come up with to stay on the natural speciation? You would not believe that. The biologists just invented a new definition of species. The species were declared as everything that refuses to breed with another, even similar species. Once upon a time, certain breed of fruit flies lived in a certain geographical area and excelled interbreeding perfectly. Then cruel fate threw them into another area, and they began to mutate there. In the end, some of them were brought back home, and they did not want to mate with old flies. Evolutionists triumphantly report, "The origin of the new species has been experimentally discovered." Specialists from the University of Michigan, Richard Lenke and his colleagues, have been conducting a long-term experiment tracking genetic changes in 12 initially identical populations of asexual Escherichia coli bacteria since the 24th of February 1988. The populations reached the milestone of 66,000 in November 2016 and exceeded 70,000 generation at the end of 2017. The most striking adaptation reported so far is the evolution of aerobic growth on citrate. And what do you think? Complete success was reported. A first step on the road to possible speciation was achieved. In order not to waste the reader's time, I will give 3 testimonies of really recognized specialists. The first of them belongs to the disciple of Theodosius Dobzhansky, an American biologist, Richard Lewontin. He declared that the theory of evolution by natural selection states that changes in the inherited characters of species occur, giving rise to differentiation in space and time because different genetic types leave different numbers of offspring in different environments. Such a theory can never be falsified, for it asserts that some environmental difference created the conditions for natural selection of a new character. It is existentially quantified so that the failure to find the environmental factor proves nothing except that one has not looked hard enough. Second is the opinion of Russian biologist Vadim Nazarov. We are once again convinced that between the races and subspecies on the one hand and the species on the other, there is an impassable gap, the hiatus. The quantitative changes accumulated by populations of introspective groupings and serving as a customary illustration of the law of dialectics do not translate into qualitative ones, the act of forming a new species. The third belongs to Yuri Altikov, academician of the Russian Academy of Scientists, director of the Institute of General Genetics. Not only the origin of man, but even the origin of ordinary biological species cannot have a random character. Each species strictly stores its uniqueness. So, the world around us cannot be the result of natural selection. But not all specialists share this view. Evolution is a fact. Most of the American, Russian, and British experts write in unison. The most popular of the modern defenders of the theory of evolution is the British Richard Dawkins, one of the 4 horsemen of new atheism. His books, The Blind Watchmaker, God as an Illusion, The Selfish Gene, as well as a dozen others have spread all over the world. I hope that the reader has already imbued with some knowledge of the history of Darwinism and got an idea of its difficulties. Do not relax. The real difficulties for Darwinists? In the next section.